Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nedarim Daf Ayin Zayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Cheryl and Avi Savitsky and family on the occasion of the 39th yahrzeit of Cheryl's father, Dr. Stephen Epstein, Shimon Fevish ben Yisrael Yitzchak HaKohen, whose Simchat HaChayim was palpable to anyone who met him and is something we strive to emulate each and every day. Today's daf is sponsored by Shiur Stern in memory of her father, Harav Reuven ben Chaim Zatzal on his yahrzeit, a warm and loving Talmud chacham. Today's daf is sponsored by Rachel and Owen Selinger in memory of Rachel's father, Alan Selinger, in memory of Rachel's father, Alan Kronish, Avner Yosef ben Yehuda Aryeh, and Zlata Priva on his 33rd yahrzeit. Too many years have passed, always thinking of you. You'd be so proud of your children learning daf Yomi. Our father was a choser b'tshuva and was always in admiration of those that learned the daf. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. Let's just review quickly what we saw yesterday in the Mishna. We saw Hafarat Nedarim, when a father or husband annuls the vows of his wife, daughter, it's only that day. Then we said, wait a minute, but there's a machloket between two tannaim about this. So it's not so clear cut as it seems in the Mishna. Either the end of that day, which means nightfall, or possibly 24 hours. Those are the two opinions. We then ended with the halacha is not like the pair of rabbis who said it's 24 hours. However, we then ended with these two stories that either meant they were measuring, they were shooting arrows and standing up and sitting down in order to create shadows to know exactly what time of day it is so that they know when 24 hours passed. Or maybe those stories really didn't relate to that at all, and only because we mentioned Rav, we mentioned his son. And this is actually not talking about hafarat nidarim, which is nullifying vows, but hatarat nidarim. We're going to call, again, it's a little hard exactly the translation, but the difference between nullifying the vow and dissolving a vow, okay? Or annulling the vow. So basically, it's possible these stories are actually talking about something totally different, which is actually going to be referred to in tomorrow's daf, and maybe that's why it's talking about something different entirely, because they're going to segue into, or maybe because of that, they get into, we're going to do some comparisons between hafara and hatara. Again, let's just be clear what each one is. Hafara is when a woman makes a vow and her father or husband basically says, we're not allowing this vow to go through. And we generally said that according to most opinions, although there are some who think otherwise, and we'll see this more in a sugya and nazir, about whether hafara seems to work from that moment going forward and not necessarily that dissolves it from way back when. But when you take a vow on your own and decide you want to get rid of the vow, then you go to either a chacham or three regular people, and they annul your vow or dissolve your vow. And why is it called dissolving? Because it dissolves it from the beginning. Okay, that for sure, it's as if you never took it. And we talked about that there's two ways to do it. This is all intro to today's class. There's either by charata, you feel bad, remorseful, you were angry in a moment of anger. There's a debate about whether that actually all works or not. And petah, which is the chacham says to you, or the three hadyotot suggests, is it possible that had you realized this ramification was going to happen from your neder, you never would have done it? If you say yes, then they can dissolve the vow. A whole bunch of different questions come up. Number one, why do you have to go to a chacham or three hadyotot? Okay, are the three hadyotot functioning like a court? Because normally three is a court, or a court could be a yachid mumche, an expert. So is it like a court? Today we're going to see that it's sort of like a court, but not really like a court. And then that begs the question, whenever we need three, we kind of call it technically a beit, but it doesn't always function like a court. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a little while. So why go to a chacham or three hadyotot, especially if it's not a court? You don't really need a court to get rid of your vow. And notice it. In the Torah, it talks about hafarat nedarim. That's the whole, we saw that all those three sections on who can nullify the vows of their wife, their daughter, etc. But it never talks about hatara. And if you remember, we learned a Mishna a long time ago. Hatara nedarim porchim ba'avil, ve'ein lehem mamashi, right? They have nothing to rely on. They're floating in the air. In other words, this is something totally oral law. It says nothing about it in the Torah that you can do that. The Torah just says you have to keep your neder. So what's this all of a sudden that you can get rid of your neder? So that's a big difference between them. The hapara it says it in the Torah, and hatara doesn't. So if we go back to our question about why hatarat nedarim, Why do we do it in this way? In other words, let's assume you can do it. What is the purpose of the chacham? So I can suggest some possibilities. One is just to add seriousness to the neder. If you can easily just get rid of your own vow, then everyone would really not take Nedarim seriously. Here, if you know you have to go to a chacham, right? It's a preventative tactic. Another possibility is if you're someone who constantly goes to the chacham to get rid of your neder, at a certain point, the chacham might give you some halachic advice or rabbi advice and just say, listen, you shouldn't be vowing all the time and you shouldn't this and that, right? And also maybe just keeping things in check. Those are some possible reasons why you would need someone else to be talking to do this rather than doing it yourself. Another interesting issue that comes up, I'm giving a bunch of intro today just because these things are important to think about. There's a debate between those who count the mitzvot. There's a whole bunch of books that count mitzvot. There's the Rambam and Sefer HaMitzvot. There's the comments of the Ramban on that, where he disagrees a lot with the Rambam about things, and this is one of them. There's the Smag and the Smak, Sefer Mitzvot Gedolot, Sefer Mitzvot Ketanot, right? And they all have a big argument about is hafara. Now, Hatarat Nedarim certainly can't be counted as a mitzvah. It's not written in the Torah, but could theoretically be a mitzvah on a rabbinic level, maybe. But is hafarat Nedarim a mitzvah? Is it counted as one of the mitzvah? The right of the husband or the father to annul the vow. Is it a mitzvah, or is it a way to get rid of something if need be, right? That's not really its own mitzvah. So the Rambam counts it as a mitzvah, but in a bit of a strange way. He doesn't say it's a mitzvah to nullify the vows of your wife or your daughter. He says it's a mitzvah. It's in Sadi Hey, if you want to look in the mitzvah Aseh Sadi Hey 95. He says it's a mitzvah ladunbo, to deal with it. Like when it comes up, you have to deal with it, okay? Or exactly how to translate it is a good question. But he does count it as a mitzvah, but not exactly saying that this is an obligation to do. The Ramban says it's just a way to get out of something, and of course you don't count that as its own separate mitzvah, and he disagrees with the Rambam counting that as a mitzvah. The Smak goes farther than the Rambam and actually counts it as an obligation. He says it's an obligation, and that's all a matter of your perspective on how we view these vows and why is the husband or the father, and that according to him, it sounds like it's an obligation for the father to get rid of them because we're trying, again, to protect the woman, and therefore she shouldn't have vows upon her, and therefore it's your job to basically come in and do it. To the extent that some minhag develops at some point where people actually, and this, if we're going to talk today about distinctions between hafara and hatara, although while we're making distinctions, we're going to see that people a little bit blurred the lines between them sometimes. And to the extent that people who go, not necessarily even lahafer, but lahatir neder, you go to a chacham to get rid of your vow, people would actually make a bracha. Okay, which is fascinating because number one, it's not even in the Torah. It's not necessarily an obligation. So why is it a mitzvah that you're making a bracha? So the Shibbolei Haleket, who's an Achron, quotes this. And he says, like no way, no how should you be making a bracha. I don't know where these people got this custom from to make a bracha. But again, it's all your perspective. If you think it's really an obligation, then theoretically you could say, well, it's an obligation. And again, blurring the lines a little bit between hafara and hatara. We're working hard to not blur the lines because we want to explain what all the differences are, but sometimes lines get blurred because they are pretty similar. And that's going to be a lot of our discussion today, where we blur the lines, where we don't, or anyway, we'll talk about comparisons of them. Okay, with all that long intro, now we're going to start our daf. I'm going to start with a quote from a Gemara in Mishna, in Masechet Shabbat. Tnan hatam, and I made reference to this already. Our Mishna was talking about someone nullifying the vows of his wife or his daughter on Shabbat. Those were the examples brought. So it's obvious from here that you can do it on Shabbat. So it's exactly what the Mishnah says in Shabbat. Mifirim nidarim b'Shabbat v'nishalim l'nidarim shehem l'tzorech haShabbat. You can nullify vows on Shabbat. And now here we're starting to compare. Nishalim l'nidarim, if you want to be shoel, what's shoel? That means you go to a chacham or 3 hedyotot to get rid of your own vows. This is hatarat nidarim. Okay, here they use the lashon of lishol, but it's the same thing. Shehen l'tzorech haShabbat. You can do it on Shabbat, but only if they're needed for Shabbat. Like, for example, I said I'm not going to have wine, and then I wanted to have wine for Kiddush or for Oneg Shabbat, something like that. Then I can get rid of my vow on Shabbat. But If it has nothing to do with Shabbat, I can't do it on Shabbat. So the first question is, why would this be? Gemara doesn't ask this, but the commentaries quote, talk about it. The Ran gives two answers in Dibor Matkil O Dilma Afilu Shalol L'Tzorach HaShabbat. Says number one at toward the end, Mechze Kedina. It looks like you're going to court. Now, nobody goes to court on Shabbat. It has the semblance of court. We don't want to do that on Shabbat. It doesn't look right. Then, now, just by the way, this is a good tactic. If you're a Rishon, let's say a commentator, and you want to come up with a reason and it doesn't say the reason. So we're at this situation where we have something that's permitted on Shabbat, but only in certain circumstances. So you have to find something that's not, it's got to be something that's not clear-cut forbidden, because if it was clearly forbidden, it wouldn't be allowed even for the purposes of Shabbat. So we're going to see what directions they all go in order to figure this out. So now he says it's mechze kedina, inami, she'en hasha'a overet l'she'ela. Or maybe because you have no choice. Okay, I'm sorry. The opposite. Hafara we're going to allow on Shabbat because you have no choice, because you might run out of time. There's a time frame. When it comes to hatara, there's no time frame. So don't do it on Shabbat if you could do it tomorrow. So it's like, right, you have a book to return to a friend on Shabbat. You might have an Erev in your community, but you shouldn't return it on Shabbat unless maybe they're going to read it on Shabbat. But if it has nothing to do with Shabbat, don't start doing something that has nothing to do with Shabbat. And we try not to do that. So maybe it's that. The Ran in Masechet Shabbat gives a different reason. He says, because it's tircha yetera. It's a big effort to go to a rabbi or to go to convene three people together. It's already an effort. There's all sorts of things in Shabbat. You might remember if you learn Masechet Shabbat that there's tircha yetera, all sorts of things. There are extra burdensome things that we don't want you to do. Another option the Rambam brings is it comes from this pasuk in Yeshayahu, which a whole bunch of laws are derived. Whenever people say it's not in the spirit of Shabbat, it's not just stam, they're saying it's not in the spirit of Shabbat. There's a pasuk in Yeshayahu which talks about im tashib mishabat raglecha, ma'asocha fatzecha v'daber davar. And from there, the Gemara learns you can't always speak about that. You can't always speak the same way you speak on Shabbat. You can't do the same things you do on Shabbat. That from there we learn about business and all that. So this Nedarim falls somewhere in between, right? It's sort of like a business transaction. It's sort of speaking in a way that you shouldn't be speaking on Shabbat. So all sorts of possibilities are brought because it's not so clear cut what the exact issue is. So now, right, that's just methodologically always interesting, which is when you have a whole bunch of different things and they're all kind of grasping at straws because nobody really knows the real reason. But it's clear that there's some issue, but again, it's not a huge issue because otherwise we wouldn't allow it for the purposes of Shabbat. So again, going back to this Mishnah seems to differentiate between hafara and hatara because it says hafara can be done on Shabbat. She'ela, which is also another word for hatara, for getting rid of your own vows, can be done only if they're for the purposes of Shabbat. However, the way I just read this is not necessarily the only way to read it. And such asks the Gemara. Abaye, they ask the following question. Mifirim nedarim b'Shabbat l'tzorech haShabbat? O dilma afilu shelo l'tzorech? The beginning of the Mishnah said, Mifirim nedarim b'Shabbat. But we understood that meant, or at least I did, I don't know how you did, but I read it as, number one, Mifirim nedarim b'Shabbat, period, new section, Nishalim le'nedarim she'em l'tzorech haShabbat. Those can only be done if they're for the purposes of Shabbat. That's one way to read it. An alternative way is, it's all one thing. Mifirim nedarim b'Shabbat, and also nishalim nedarim b'Shabbat, but only if they're l'tzorech haShabbat, and then that applies to the entire, both of them. And then both of them would only be permitted if they're l'tzorech haShabbat. So that's the question. I'll read it from the beginning. Mifirim nedarim b'Shabbat l'tzorech haShabbat. Can you nullify vows, father or the husband of his daughter or wife, for the purposes of Shabbat? Oh, Dilma afilu shelo l'tzorech, maybe if it doesn't have anything to do with Shabbat. Tashma, let's learn from here. The Tani Rav Zuti Deber Rav Papi, Rav Zuti from the house of Rav Papi brought a braita. It's an Amora quoting a braita. Ein mifirim nedarim ela l'tzorech haShabbat. Says it explicitly against the way we read the Mishnah, which is you can only be made for a nedarim for the purposes of Shabbat. So, meaning you can't just be made for any ned. Okay, well, what's the problem? Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, well, how could you possibly say this? Halot nan hachi. It's certainly not what it says in our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? Nadra im chashecha. The example was she takes a vow before nightfall. Meferla ad shelo techshach. He has until nightfall to, right? It could be 5 minutes. Like that's all he has to be made for her neder. No, iamrat l'tzorech haShabbat in shelo l'tzorech haShabbat lo. And if you said only if the neder was something that related to Shabbat. Then it shouldn't have said before nightfall. It should have differentiated, should have said, okay, there's all different ways to understand why specifically those words are problematic and what it should have said, but kind of try to explain it roughly, which is maybe give you a few different interpretations, but it should have said only, right, what's missing the main thing, which is only Nedarim that are for the purposes of Shabbat, right? It sounds from our Mishna that it all depends on the time of day. And as long as there's a little time in the day, then that's all you have. You only have that day. And it doesn't say, but only if it's L'tzorach HaShabbat. And not only that, but it makes it seem like if it was before nightfall, you could do it on Shabbat. It sounds like no matter what. So it's definitely not clear from the Mishnah that it's only Nedarim L'tzorach Shabbat. And what they're saying is it should have said, even during the day, you can't necessarily, right? It was saying if it's just before nightfall, you can do it until nightfall. But even during the day, you can't necessarily do it if it's not L'tzorach Shabbat. So that's the main part is really missing from the text. To which the Gemara answers, Tanaihi. Actually, it's a Tannaitic debate. And not only is it a Tannaitic debate, so let's just say our Mishnah holds you don't need to do it L'tzorach Shabbat. The braita that Rav Zuti quoted was it can only be done if it's L'tzorach Shabbat, meaning in this issue, there's no differentiation between Hadran and Hafara. But more interestingly, it's all based on the machloket we saw yesterday. Hafara Nedarim kol hayom, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, amru me'et le'et. Here's our debate. Is it all day, just that day, or is it 24 hours? Lemanda amal kol hayom in tfelo, the one who says you have all day and no more, you have till the end of that day and no more, afilu shelo l'tzorach haShabbat mefer, and that was our Mishnah, because that was the whole opinion in our Mishnah. Even not for the purpose of Shabbat. Why? Because if you only have that day, that's your only chance. So of course we're going to let you do it on Shabbat. If we don't let you do it on Shabbat, then every time a wife vows on Shabbat, we're not going to be able to get rid of her neder ever. But the one who says 24 hours, then it's only going to be if it's necessary for Shabbat or not, because you have 24 hours. You could do it tomorrow or tonight or, Motzei Shabbat. So you normally, obviously, if it's 24 hours and it was the exact beginning of Shabbat and it'll end before Shabbat ends, then again, you'll be allowed. But if it's beyond, then you won't be allowed to do it. So there we see, it's a machloket tannaim. So the main thing we did until now was to show that this issue does, hatarat nedarim for sure can only be done if it's for the purposes of Shabbat, if it's needed for the day, and hafara, there's a debate about it. One thing I want to point out, where do we see this come up in halacha? On Yom Kippur, we do call nidre at the beginning of Yom Kippur, and we talked about this earlier in the Masechet, that it's not really an actual getting rid of your vows, it's more viewed as a prayer, but that wasn't always the case, and some people went against it for all sorts of reasons when people were doing it. They said, what are you doing? You can't do this. There's all sorts of halachic issues. One of the halachic issues they raise is, well, you're doing it on Shabbat, and you're right, Yom Kippur is like Shabbat, and you're not allowed to do it on Shabbat. So some people say, oh, that's why they do it when Yom Kippur starts, right at the beginning. It's really before Yom Kippur starts. Of course, what about women who light candles? It's a bit of a problem, right? Because you've already accepted Yom Kippur. So in any case, some people say that's why Kol Nidre specifically is the very first prayer before Yom Kippur really comes in, because it's something that normally you can't really do on that day. Other people say, no, what more litzorech than getting rid of your vows before Yom Kippur starts? It's needed for the day because you need to start kind of with a clean slate. And therefore, it's specifically litzorech the day. So even if you say it is a halachic, and within the view, obviously there's the view that it's just a prayer and you're not actually doing anything halachic at all. And then we have no questions at all. But the other option is it is halachic and that's why we make it early, or it is halachic and it's fine though, because it's actually within the halacha because it is litzorech. Okay? That's just an interesting outcome of outgrowth of our study. Nish'alim le'nidarim shehen l'tzorech haShabbat. So now we said that you're allowed, this is a quote from the Mishnah that we quoted in Masechet Shabbat. You can be matir, as we say, undo your vows, your own vows, with a chacham or 3 adyotot, as long as they're l'tzorech haShabbat. So here's another question, classic question that they ask. Abaye lehu, k'shelo haya lehem pnai, or dilma k'shaya lehem pnai. where they had a chance to do this before, or they didn't have a chance to do it before, right? You could ask the same question about Yom Kippur. It might be for the purposes of Yom Kippur, but do it earlier, right? It says you don't push things off on Erev Shabbat that are allowed to be done on Shabbat because, you'll say, I'm busy today with other things. Let's just push that off and I'll deal with it then. Again, depending on what it is. But you shouldn't push off things that are halachic issues. And if it's not a halachic issue, that's fine. But if it's a halachic issue that is only going to be allowed because, right, what's a good example? Chol HaMoed. You're not supposed to do work on Chol HaMoed. If it's davar ha'aved, right, you're going to have a loss, whatever. But what if you could have done it before and you just pushed it off because you said, I have other things I won't be able to do on Chol HaMoed. I'll just push that off and I'll do that work on Chol HaMoed. That's more of a problem. So they ask the same question here. So they prove here from an example. Tashma is the kiku le Rabbanan le braita Rav Zutra braita Rav Zera. The rabbis were called in for the son of Rav Zutra, who was the son of Rav Zera, to get rid of his vows. And what was the situation? They called the rabbis in on Shabbat to deal with his vow that obviously had to do with Shabbat. And it was something he could have done before Shabbat, and yet they called him in to do it and they dealt with it. So here you see that even if you could have done it before Shabbat and you didn't, it's still okay to deal with it on Shabbat. Rav Yosef Lememar, whenever it says somebody thought to say, we're always going to reject it. So Rav Yosef thought to say, Nishalim Nedarim b'Shabbat, b'yachid mumchein, b'shlosha hedyotot. Lo, I told you we get back to this judgment thing. He said if it's by one-on-one, no problem. But if you're going in front of three people, don't do that on Shabbat because it looks like you're going to court. Mechze kedina, right? This is where obviously the Ran took it from here. Right? Going before three adults looks like you're going to court. We don't want it to look. We don't like the look here. It doesn't look right that you're convening court on Shabbat. People might also come to incorrect conclusions. Okay, of convening a court on Shabbat is going to be permitted, and you're not allowed to do that. Your courts don't rule on Shabbat. Courts don't rule at night. Courts, all sorts of rules about courts. In fact, we're going to deal with a lot of them today, and we're going to show that Hadran Nedarim, for the most part, we don't do any of those things. All of those things are permitted. All the regulations about a court aren't really here. And that's where I was saying the three hadyotot and the court that we're convening, so to speak, is not really a court, but it does look like a court. So therefore, Rav Yosef said, it would seem to me that you shouldn't do this on Shabbat. Amarle Abaye, who was his student, if you remember, Abaye says to him, I disagree. Kevan desfir lan afilu me'umad, which was possibly one of the opinions, right? That end story of the rabbi who sat down and stood up, where it means he could have sat, he could have done it either way. Normally at judgment, you sit. Why do you sit? Because you have to focus. If you're standing, you're never fully focused. If you're standing, you're always like ready to get out of there. But if you're sitting, you give it the proper thought. So says, since we can do it, afilu me'umad, even standing up, afilu b'krovim, you can even have relatives do it. Okay, like if you're on, we do hatarat nedarim, not kol nidre, but hatarat nedarim, where it's a more halachic thing that they do before, and on Erev Rosh Hashanah usually, or sometimes just before Yom Kippur. When you do that and you sit in front of three people, if it's a relative of yours, it doesn't matter. It's okay, because this isn't a real court. Afilu balayla, even if it's at night, which again, the court never convenes at night, lo mitchaze kedina. Because of all these things, no one's going to really think that it's a din, because they know that this is interesting. Even if you're not using your relatives, or even if you're not doing it at night, it still doesn't really look like you're convening court, because everybody knows that Hatarat Nedarim is not really court. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Halacha. So Rabbi Abba, just pay attention to who's who. Rabbi Abba brings the words of Rav Huna, who quoted Rav, as saying, Halacha mefirim nedarim balayla. So he quotes Rav as saying exactly what Abaye just said, one of the things anyway, which is you can do it at night. Vaha matnitinis, and how they say, so wait, it's not exactly, sorry, my confusion. I told you it's confusing here. This is mifirim, and before we were talking about mitirim. Okay, remember the difference. Hatara is in front of a court or a yachid mumche, individual specialist, versus hafara, which is just the father to the daughter or the husband to the wife. So he says the halacha is you can be mefer nedarim at night. That's what they quote in the name of Rav. To which the Gemara said, "V'hamanitinhi, isn't that a Mishnah? Nadrabale le Shabbat." We saw that if she does it at night, remember Friday night, she has all that night and the next day. So it's very clear from the Mishnah. You don't need to quote Rav as saying something that says explicitly in the Mishnah. Ela ema halacha nishalim balayla. They say, oh no, correct it. What Rav really said is that hatarat nedarim can be done at night, okay, in front of the court or in front of the, right, which isn't really a court, or in front of a yachid mumcha. So this was quoted by Rabbi Abba, who quoted Rav Huna, who quoted Rav. Now, I'll already tell you there's two different versions of this, and even within the version, I'm going to explain there's different ways to understand this next line, but I'll read it now in one way. Amarle Rabbi Abba le Rav Huna. So Rabbi Abba, who quoted this in the name of Rav Huna and the name of Rav, says to Rav Huna, Amar Rav Hachi, did Rav really say this? To which, because he heard it from Rav Huna, to which Amarle Ishtik. He said, well, I said it, and Rav was silent. So he assumed that meant Rav agreed. To which Rabbi Abba says, Amarle Ishtik kamarta or shate kamarta? Was he silent because he agreed with you? Or was he drinking and therefore was busy and wasn't paying attention, or didn't respond to you because he was in the middle of something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he agreed with you. Maybe he disagreed with you. And that's how can you quote him as saying it just because he was silent? Okay, there's many different interpretations of whether ishtik is that way or shate is that way, and what shate means, and maybe it means something else. Either which way, in this reading, it's Rabbi Abba asking Rav Huna, did Rav really say this? To which he answers, right? Rav was silent, he didn't really say it, to which Rabbi Abba says, well, then it's not really clear that Rav held this way. And in the version that I'm going with, really the next two words should be tashma. Some people have that in their text. Okay, come and learn an answer from here, which then we're going to prove that clearly Rav did think you could do it at night. Okay, even though he was silent and his silence wasn't clear, but from his actions it was clear. And Amarav Ika Ba'avin is the Kikle Rav Rabba. There was a case where they brought in Rav for the purposes of Rabba to get rid of his vows. Bikitona de Beit Rav, in this, again, different interpretations of what exactly this is, but possibly some side room in the Beit Midrash of Rav. Omed Yichidi Ubalayla. He did it standing up, he did it by himself, and he did it at night. And from there you learn that Rav clearly did it at night. Okay, that's one version. There's another way of reading it. I'm not going to go into it because it's not so critical, but I mean, it's critical, but I'm not going to go into, there's a different version of reading all this, and that this next line really had nothing to do with the previous, and it wasn't. I'm not going to, but if you want to read it, you can read it in the Ran. He has a different way of reading it. Amal Rabba, Amal Rav Nachman. So far, and continuing, we're now on Abaye. We're continuing now in this idea how all of these, the last part of what we've been reading, is showing that against Rav Yosef, who said, don't do this because it looks like a court, we're now showing all the ways. This is why I said in the beginning of class, it's interesting to see when are three people needed that they don't actually function like a court. Okay, in fact, I was thinking about it because in my shul, we always do it on Erev Yom Kippur because a lot of people come from Mincha and we do Hatarat Nedarim. And on the beit din was a father and son. You know, and some people were looking at this is a little weird. Why is there a father and son? But you see here that krovim is not an issue at all because it's really not a court. Okay, and that's what's, I think it's very interesting to research, you know, when three is a court and when three is not exactly a court, and they're needed possibly for some other reason. But we use the same kind of term, three hedyotot and three people, but it's not always to be like a court. Amar Rabba Amar Rav Nachman. Halacha nishalim nidarim omed yichidi ubalayla ubeshabbat ubekrovim va'afilu hayalem pnaimi ba'od yom. He's got a whole list of all the leniencies here. So again, it's sort of review. You can do it standing. You can do it by yourself. You can do it at night. You can do it on Shabbat. You can do it with relatives. And you can do it for your relatives. And even if they could have done it before Shabbat, as long as it's L'tzorech Shabbat, it's not a problem. Omed, you could do it standing. 1 minute. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita? Yarad Rabban Gamliel min hachamor v'nitatef v'yashav v'yitir lo nidro. We now bring a braita to contradict Rav Nachman. We say, look, Rabban Gamliel, when he needed to do Hatarat Nedarim, he got off his donkey, he wrapped himself up, sat down, and then did the neder, got rid of someone's neder. So why did he do that if you don't need to do it? So to which the Gemara answers, and here I'm going to read you the two different versions. Okay, I don't want to confuse you too much every day in each section, but it's just interesting. This is really different versions that have, I said the last one maybe didn't have huge ramifications. This has really big ramifications. Rabban Gamliel Saval, I'm going to read it first the way it appears in the text in the Gemara, and then I'm going to read it the way the corrections say. Rabban Gamliel Savar, potchim becharata. He says, this is, by the way, a funny thing, because he says, potchim becharata. Usually it's petach or charata. So what is potchim becharata? So the way it's understood according to this version is, means when somebody comes to you, they don't immediately say, I regret what I did. They just say, I want to get rid of my vow. So Rabban Gamliel says, your job is to say to them, maybe you regret what you did. And just like you make a petach, you can also suggest, maybe you regret what you did. Okay? It's your responsibility. So Rabban Gamliel says, listen, if the person comes to you and doesn't say, I regret what I did, your responsibility is to say, do you regret what you did? Maybe you regret. And then, so to do that, you have to sit down and talk to them and converse with them and think about it. And therefore, right, you need to uproot the neder, and therefore you need to sit and think about it, and therefore you have to sit. Rav Nachman he says, you don't have to. Somebody comes to me to matir a neder, there's two options. Either they come and they say, I'm really sorry about what I did. And then I say, yeah, your neder's mutar. Now I don't need to focus on that. That's fine. You said, I'm sorry, and move on. If they come and they don't say they're sorry about it, they just say, I want to get rid of my neder. I don't need to start suggesting to them, are you sorry about what you did? Are you remorseful? Were you in a moment of anger? I don't need to do that. So therefore I could do it standing. And in that case, I just don't nullify, I don't get rid of their vow. I just let them go. I say, sorry, I can't help you. So therefore you can do it standing up. That's one way of reading it. It's a bit of a strange way of reading it, I have to say, because first of all, we haven't really talked about this potchim b'charata. And, seems a little weird. Why wouldn't you potchim b'charata if we're trying to get rid of Nedarim in general? You would think. Some people have the exact opposite version, and it doesn't have to do with specifically this idea of potchim b'charata, even though that's the language. But Rabban Gamliel, I'm going to read it now from the beginning, the other way, because it's going to be the actual reverse. Rabban Gamliel savar lo potchim b'charata. You can't just say, I feel bad, I did something. That would be easy. And then the judge could just stand. You can't use charata at all. And if you remember, when we talked about charata, we said there was a bit of a debate. So according to this reading, this is the debate. Rabban Gamliel says, you can't use charata to get rid of a vow. And therefore, you have to really uproot the neder. How do you do that? With a petach. To do a petach, you have to sit, you have to talk, you have to suggest, you have to have a whole correspondence. Did you realize the ramifications of what you did? And that if you had realized this, would you have taken the vow? You can't just do that standing up. Rav Nachman says, now instead of ein potchim b'charata, potchim b'charata, you can just use remorse. And therefore, afilu me'umad, that's easy to do. You don't have to sit. Obviously, if that doesn't work, then you might need to move to petach, and then maybe you need to sit. But that's a whole different version, which then shows you that Rabban Gamliel sides on the side, the charata is not valid for hatarat nedarim. That has huge ramifications, how you read this Gemara. Amarle Rava leRav Nachman. I saw someone who came from, rabbi who came from Eretz Israel, from Israel, Va'amal, and he said, is dekiku le Rabbanan the beit Rav Huna bar Avin ushar le nidre. The rabbis were gathered together to nullify, to annul, to dissolve the vow of the son of Rav Huna bar Avin, and they did it. Okay, so they got the rabbis together. This seems to be disconnected with what we've been talking about until now. It doesn't have to do with Shabbat or anything. And while or after they got rid of his vow, but you should go pray for your soul because you sinned. Why did he sin? And this goes back to something we always keep mentioning over and over again. It wasn't enough to just mention it once or twice. We have to keep going back here. Anyone who vows is considered a sinner. Okay? Okay, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to have a siyum. I haven't yet announced that we haven't come out with the publicity, but anyway, on Tuesday, you can already put it in your calendar. On Tuesday, January 24th, we're going to have a siyum. One of the topics is going to be the difference between, Rabbanit Dina Sternberg is going to speak about the difference between the Torah's view of vows and Nazirut versus what happens in the rabbinic world and how anti they are, right? The Torah doesn't necessarily put it in such a negative light, but definitely the Gemara and the rabbis here took it in a very negative way and didn't like vows at all, or people being Nazirs. Again, there were different approaches, but for the most part, this was the approach that was definitely more overbearing. So anyone who vows, even if he keeps his vow, is considered a sinner. Rav Zvid Ma'ikra. Rav Zvid says, what's the proof in the Torah for this? V'chi techdal lindor, this is the pasuk after it says, when you take a vow, you have to keep what you said. V'chi techdal lindor, and when you stop to vow, lo yeh b'chachet, there will not be a sin upon you. So what does this seem to imply? Ha lo chadalta, if you don't stop, then ikachet, then you're sinning. So if you continue to vow, you're basically sinning. Only when you stop vowing, then, or refrain from vowing, then you won't have a sin. But if you do vow, then you're going to be considered a sinner. Tanya, ha'omer li'ishto. So that was a total non sequitur, which was just talking about, yes, on the one hand, and as it's connected, because you can get rid of your vows, but know that you sinned, even though theoretically getting rid of, right, and this is interesting, because let's say, we've talked about how hatara goes and erases it from the beginning. So let's say I took a vow not to eat, I went against my vow, I then got rid of my vow, so I'm not actually, I'm not responsible for what I did, because I basically got rid of my vow from the beginning, dissolved it. But I'm actually a sinner anyway, because I took a vow in the first place, according to this. And obviously in a case where, or even in a case, I should say, where I kept my vow and still dissolved it, I'm still responsible for having taken that vow. So even though it erases it, it doesn't erase it entirely, because I did something and I did something wrong by taking the vow in the first place, even though I've managed to get rid of it. Tanya, another issue. Now we're moving on to the language of how you do it. And this is again comparing the two, or in the beginning, we won't be comparing it toward the end of this, so we will. Ha'omer li'ishto, if you say to your wife, kol nedarim shetiduli, efshi shetiduli, all the nedarim that you're vowing, it's not possible that you should be taking this vow, or ein zen neder, this is not a vow, lo amar klum, this is not the proper language to actually get rid of your neder. Okay, in order to get rid of the neder, it has to be using the language of hafaran, meferet neder, something like that, mufarlach. Okay, but not just saying this isn't a neder, or anything you say is not possible that you could take a vow. That's not clear enough language. But when it comes to ratifying the vow, if you say yafasit, oh, nice that you did that after she vows, or enk motecho, there's nobody like you. You can see the husband saying this beautiful line, there's no one like you, meaning I'm so glad, so pleased that you took this vow. Ve'im lo nadart midirechani, and if you hadn't taken the vow, I would have taken the vow and forbidden you to do this, because I'm so glad you did this. Then dvarav kayamim. For ratification, that's enough. Possibly one of the reasons is ratification can also be done with silence, right? Silence plus time. If it's already the next day, then your silence is considered ratification. So to ratify it is a lot easier, but to actually do hapara is more, it requires more work. This is interesting because before we compared them differently, right? And we also said, are they the same or are they different? This seems to ignore that hekesh between the two, that what's true for one is true for the other. Lo yomar adam li'ishto b'Shabbat. Now, even though you have to say something like mufer lechi, on Shabbat, you can't say that language. And this goes back to what we said about your speech on Shabbat has to be a little bit different. So, lo yamar adam li'ishto b'Shabbat, mufer lechi, batel lechi. Okay, those are the languages that work. Mufer or batel. It's right, nullified. Kederech shomer la b'chol. You can't say it the same way you say it on a weekday. Ela, omer la. So now all of a sudden we're learning, yes, you can do it on Shabbat, but you have to do it differently. It's like we learned all these cases with the shino, you have to change something. Tli v'ichli, tli ushti. Let's say she said, I won't eat grapes. So he gives her grapes and he says, here, take them and eat them. That's indicating that the vow is nullified. Or take and drink. V'haneder batel me'elav. And then the neder just is gone when he says that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan v'tzarich she'vatel blibo. Rabbi Yochanan says, but wait, that's not enough. You also have to, in your heart, the husband has to say, it's batel. Now, what does it mean in your heart? Every time we come to in your heart, there's always this debate. Does in your heart mean you have to actually express it in words the same way you pray? We don't pray in our hearts and not say the words. We say the words, we just say them silently. So do you have to say the words silently, or can you just think it? That's an interesting debate that comes up a lot when we talk about machshava. The main sugya we're going to see when we get to the first sugya in Zvachim, which is about sacrifice, is pigul. Pigul is when the Kohen has the wrong machshava. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean he has to say it, even to himself, or even just thinking it in his head? It's a very fascinating debate about, in general, when we say thinking something. Tanya, another braita about this. Beit Shammai omrim b'Shabbat mevatel b'libo. B'chol motzi b'sfatav. Beit Shammai seems to be what we said in Talmud. On a regular day, you have to actually express it and say it. On Shabbat, it's enough to just think it. Again, think it could be it could, right? Then here it becomes complicated because it sounds like mivatel v'sfatav is just saying it in words, maybe not necessarily anyone hearing it. And bilibo sounds really clearly like just thinking it. But it could be motzi b'sfatav to other people, so the people hear as opposed to just thinking it inside. He says regular hapara, you actually don't even need to say, even on a regular weekday, you don't actually need to express it in words. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, chacham shamar b'lashon baal, ubaal shamar b'lashon chacham lo amar klum. Now I'm going to wait for the braita. We'll start the braita tomorrow that proves this, but I want to just start with the idea and then we'll see it inside because it'll go both ways and I'll just start at tomorrow's class, which is, if now this is the real comparison of, or another comparison of hapara and hatara. Each has their own unique language. So if you use the wrong language and you say hapara when you're doing hatara, or you say hatara when you're doing hafara, it doesn't work. So you can't mix the languages. You see here, like we've been saying all along, in neder, the language is super important, what you said and what you mean. Also in undoing the neder, there's two different ways of undoing it. Like I said, it's a little confusing. You think it's all one and the same. And this sugya is trying to tell you all the differences. It's not one and the same at all. They're two very different mechanisms and they each have their own languages associated with them. And we don't want you to confuse them. And therefore, if you use the wrong language, it doesn't work. And they're going to get this from a drasha and the psukim. So we'll leave that for tomorrow. We'll start at the very bottom here in tomorrow's class. Okay, so we saw a lot of different topics in comparing hafara and hatara. We talked about Shabbat. We talked about the issue of the court for hatarat nedarim. Is it really a court? In what ways is it not like court? What can be done on Shabbat? What can't be done on Shabbat? Different opinions about that. We saw, again, this idea of nedarim are bad. That was just an additional thing that we saw. And how you can undo a neder, petach and charata, maybe just petach, not charata. Or maybe that wasn't what the sugya was talking about. Maybe it was talking about something else. Do you need to liftoch b'charata or not, or only if they come with regret? All sorts of different interesting things about how to get rid of your vows. Wishing everyone a great day. See you tomorrow.